Hi everyone, I hope you all are well. I'm Yi Xin, co-president of BioSoc. Thanks very much for joining us for the fourth talk of the year. We would first like to thank our first corporate sponsor of the year, CRISPR Biotech Engineering, an early-stage genome editing company using CRISPR-Cas9 to develop genomics-based therapies as well as providing educational resources. Today, we are honored to have Professor Richard Gunderman as our speaker. Professor Gunderman is the Chancellor's Professor of Multiple Disciplines at Indiana University. The disciplines include, for example, medical humanities and health studies, medical education, and philosophy. He is a 10-time recipient of the Indiana University Trustees Teaching Award, and he has also received many other teaching awards. He's an author of over 800 articles and 15 books. This year, he published Contagion, a book on the history and science of transmissible diseases. The talk today will be followed by a Q&A session, which will be moderated by me. So if you are watching on YouTube, feel free to post your questions throughout the talk. And if you're on Zoom, you could ask your questions in person, post them on the chat, or you could send them privately to me as well. So without further ado, let's now welcome Professor Gunderman to deliver his talk. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be with you today, and I hope you'll find this discussion enlightening and perhaps somewhat provocative. The idea behind it is we're in the midst of a terrible pandemic, not the first time human beings have found ourselves in this position. But that often the lessons of pandemics are lost on us. For one reason, we're eager to get beyond pandemics, and many of us are inclined not to think about them very much anymore. But in fact, if we can dwell with them for a while and peer into their deeper meaning, I think we can actually gain some insights on how to live more fully or perhaps even live better lives. So some of you may know the American philosopher George Santayana, who famously said that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And of course, we've made a great deal of progress in medicine and the biological sciences since some of the more recent pandemics like HIV/AIDS and the 1918 influenza pandemic. But in many cases, the lessons learned have faded from memory. And in other cases, I don't think we've thought deeply enough about the pandemics to learn the lessons in the first place. So today is an effort to think about this worldwide outbreak of transmissible disease and try to derive from it some lessons that pertain not only to the care of patients or to public health measures to reduce disease transmission, but even some lessons that might apply to all of us in terms of how we lead our lives. So I want to make 4 quick points about the COVID-19 pandemic. And I trust we all know this, but I think it's important to set this context. And lesson number 1 is that our situation is not as novel as we might have been led to believe. Certainly there are aspects, so far as we know, we haven't confronted SARS-CoV-2 before, but in many respects, this is similar to other pandemics, particularly those involving respiratory microbes. So lesson number 1, it's not novel, and I'll just mention a couple of examples. One is the 1918 influenza pandemic. Here you can see military personnel at Fort Riley in Kansas, a state in the United States where the epidemic may have originated. But in the 1918 influenza pandemic, it's estimated that about 500 million people contracted the virus, and deaths were probably about 50 million, a huge number, especially when you consider the population of the world was much smaller than it is today. By the way, some estimates have been as high as 100 million people dying from pandemic influenza between 1918 and 1920. but it's certainly a very high number. We're all familiar with HIV/AIDS. These are actually AIDS quilts laid out on the ground in the American city of Washington, D.C. You can see there on the right the Washington Monument, an obelisk in honor of the first president, George Washington. But of course, HIV/AIDS is thought to have infected about 75 million people. And obviously, it's a particularly lethal virus, resulting in about 33 million deaths. And COVID-19, by comparison, unfortunately, the number's rising all the time. But I think we're now at around 43 million infections and somewhere north of 1.2 million deaths. So a lot of people have lost their lives from COVID-19. But on the other hand, it's a number that as yet is relatively small in comparison to, say, the influenza epidemic of 1918, or even the more recent HIV/AIDS pandemic that might be said to have started in the early 1980s, although, of course, there were infected individuals for decades before that. And these are photographic portraits of some of the people in the United States who lost their lives to COVID-19. And I just want to point out that, in fact, pandemics are really not novel. There is clear prehistoric evidence, back before we have written records, that some communities were at least hit by epidemics. It's difficult to establish that there were pandemics because, of course, that involves designating them as multinational. But we can at least say that whole communities seem to have suffered greatly from epidemic diseases of one kind or another. And again, this is a theme that goes very far back in Western history. Some of you may remember Thucydides and the history of the Peloponnesian War. The Athenians have a great strategy, courtesy of Pericles, to withdraw within the walls of the city and basically wait out the besieging Spartans. But as you know, that strategy turned out to be a disaster because population densities and problems with sanitation became so great within the city walls that the Athenians suffered a severe plague. You may also know that the first big appearance, at least in the Western world, of bubonic plague took place in the 6th century, the so-called plague of Justinian. And of course, the bubonic plague came back multiple times, including most especially in the 14th century with the bubonic plague in Europe. You may know that Boccaccio's Decameron, a great work of world literature, its occasion is the exodus of a group of 10 young adults from Florence, Italy, escaping the bubonic plague. And of course, accounts like Boccaccio's and Thucydides provide us some deep insights into the social aspects of pandemics. In both cases, if you read Thucydides' account of the Athenian plague and the early parts of Boccaccio's Decameron, in a sense, social order might be said to have broken down. And some people of whom we would expect more conducted themselves in rather unfortunate ways. So that, by the way, is an early copy of Boccaccio's Decameron. And I just want to remind us all that, we live in an era of at least potential biowarfare. And in fact, human beings have been using biological agents for warfare for a very long time. We have at least the potential for man-made pandemics. And, it's thought that the bubonic plague in the 14th century may have made its way from Asia to Europe, in part because Mongol invaders who were besieging the town of Kaffa actually took their comrades who died of plague and catapulted their bodies over the city's wall, in an attempt to spread the pestilence. And there are unfortunate, more recent examples. For example, here in North America, agents like smallpox, the blankets were rubbed on individuals with smallpox and then given as gifts to Native American populations who possessed little innate immunity to the disease of smallpox. And of course, the consequences were disaster. You think of other examples, the decline of the Incan and Aztec empires. We often think that's a matter of military conquest, that it has to do with gunpowder and swords and so forth. But in fact, a good bit of the conquest, so-called, was made possible by infectious diseases. So point number one, pandemics aren't new. And if we take the time to inquire, I think we can learn a lot from historical sources that can be helpful to us today and in the future. Another point I want to make, some of you may know I'm a practicing physician. I'm actually speaking to you from the Children's Hospital in which I work. And it's very important to realize that the disease, COVID-19, isn't purely the product of SARS-CoV-2, which is to say that in the case of any infectious disease, we can't produce the disease without the microbe, but a good bit of its pathologic manifestations have to do with the host response to the microbe and not simply the presence of the microbe. So in some cases, the failure to respond or an excessive response or a misdirected response to the pathogen is in fact the source of much of the disease and suffering. And just a couple of examples. In the case of the 1918 influenza, perhaps the worst pandemic humankind has ever known in terms of its scale. It's thought that a lot of people died not just from the influenza virus, H1N1, but because of so-called cytokine storm, what we might think of as a hyperactive or excessive immune system response to the presence of the virus. And, on the other side, many people may be more susceptible to infections of any number of types of infections, not just viruses, but bacteria, protozoa, parasites, and so forth. We may be more susceptible to those organisms due to factors like malnutrition. And I don't want to suggest that I know vitamin D deficiency is a cause of increased immune susceptibility to COVID-19, but there's mounting evidence that people who fare poorly with the disease often have relatively low levels of vitamin D. And these findings like this lead us to think that it could be that one of the key strategies in the treatment of COVID-19 is not strictly antivirals, but medications that can modulate the response of the immune system. For example, if patients are ending up in the intensive care unit on ventilators because of an excessive response, say, directed at the respiratory system, well, maybe drugs like corticosteroids, which you might say suppress the immune response, perhaps such medications could be useful. So number one, COVID-19 isn't new. Number two, much of the disease as we know it is the human response to the pathogen and not simply the effect of the pathogen itself. Well, point number three is that COVID-19 isn't merely a biological phenomenon. This is Li Wenliang, who might be called one of the early whistleblowers or perhaps martyrs to COVID-19, somebody who shared information and a suspicion that it was due to a novel coronavirus and actually ran afoul of of political authorities by raising concern about it. But when you think about a disease like HIV/AIDS and the immune system, in many cases, diseases like COVID-19 can attack the systems, and obviously not the virus directly, but the presence of the disease in our communities and our society can end up disabling or compromising the performance of say, our hospitals or health professionals like nurses and physicians. We've had a number of health professionals contract the disorder and in some cases be taken out of action, be rendered unable to do their job for periods of days and weeks and even months. So, another effect would be for what we here tend to call first responders, police, firefighters, social workers, these systems that we count on to fight other forms of disaster, house fires, criminal activity, what have you, they're compromised by the presence of COVID-19. So it's not just damaging patients, it's damaging the people who help patients. It's not just damaging patients, it's damaging our neighbors and our fellow citizens. And in some cases, those are people in the so-called helping professions who are less able to come to our aid. And of course, there's been a dramatic effect on organizations like businesses. A good number of people have lost their jobs. Many businesses are closing. In some cases, schools have closed. And, this doesn't just make it less convenient to shop for groceries. It can land people in pretty serious economic straits. So one impact of COVID-19 has been to increase the number of jobless people, the number of individuals and families who can't support themselves economically. And of course, that has big consequences, not only today, but potentially for years and even decades to come. If the schooling of children or even university students is compromised, we may be paying a price for that for some time. So the biological effects are important and they tend to dominate our field of view, but they're certainly not the only effects. And this brings up an important point that we've all considered, I think, that we need to make sure that our efforts to respond to COVID-19 don't inflict unnecessary or excessive harm. We don't want the cure to become worse than the disease. And this has happened multiple times in human history. For example, in the so-called Black Death in Europe, certain groups of individuals, such as Jews, were singled out as culprits. It was suggested that wells were being poisoned or streams were being poisoned. And in some cases, hundreds and even thousands of people were killed because basically they were posited as scapegoats. It was their fault. If we eliminate them, the disease will go away. Well, of course, that's not the case. But sometimes the presence of a pandemic can lead us to turn away from people in need and sometimes even attack people in need. And, we need to be careful that we don't let that happen today. And the final point I want to make, there are only 4 of these, is that COVID-19 isn't just a matter of health. As you know, one of the most common responses, there's mask wearing and hand hygiene. But another big response is so-called social distancing, including people who've contracted the virus being in isolation, basically cut off from most contact with other human beings, and those who've been exposed to infected individuals being placed in quarantine. This sounds like a very effective public health strategy, and it is, but we need to recognize it can come with a pretty substantial human cost. And often this cost is borne by people who are least able to cope with it. We know the elderly are probably on balance at greater risk for becoming very ill, needing intensive care, dying from COVID-19. The same could be said for the infirm, that is, people, let's say, with chronic medical conditions. And the same is true for the poor. So those at greatest risk are also those perhaps least resilient in the face of quarantine, isolation, social distancing. Often we're taking people who are already to some degree isolated and then isolating them even further. And that may be an especially heavy burden for them to bear. And I just want to mention, here in the United States, one of our former Surgeon Generals, Vivek Murthy, was raising an alarm in the United States in the year 2017 that the nation's in the midst of a loneliness epidemic. He referred to it as an epidemic. Almost half of people over age 65 years feel lonely on a regular basis. And it turns out that feeling lonely is bad for our health. It's been suggested that loneliness is as hazardous in terms of health as smoking 16 cigarettes a day. And the death rate for lonely individuals appears to be about 45% increased compared to people who aren't lonely. Now, I don't want to suggest for a second that the reason to pay attention to loneliness is because it has adverse health consequences, but I do want us to recognize that it does have adverse health consequences. And of course, there's a lot of suffering that human beings endure in a pandemic that don't have to do strictly with health. And I put loneliness, grief, bereavement, near the top of that list. People scared that they're going to lose their own lives, people who are cut off from other people, in part because of that fear, and people who actually lose loved ones who find themselves in a state of grief. I think this kind of suffering goes far beyond health in the ordinary sense. And, happily, we have some means at our disposal to counteract that. We're all familiar with social media. Sometimes the elderly aren't terribly conversant with social media, but maybe they're at least comfortable using a telephone through video conferencing and so forth. We may not be able to be in one another's physical presence, face to face in the same room, but at least we can see one another as we're seeing each other right now via video conferencing. So, it's important to recognize that we do have these means of response, electronic means of connecting people who are otherwise cut off, and making sure they are shared and accessible to the people who need them most. So, we have people in our midst who, let's say, because of COVID-19 and so-called lockdowns, may need help with chores around their homestead, may need help shopping. Sometimes it means a lot to somebody just to check in, by phone, just to let them know that we're thinking about them. And as we respond to the pandemic, I think we need to respond not just to viruses and immune systems, but also respond to family members and neighbors and fellow citizens, trying to be responsible neighbors to the extent we can. So anyway, the purpose of this so far has been to lay a kind of groundwork, maybe to set up a sort of background in which we can think about the opportunities that exist for a pandemic to enlighten us, to illuminate paths by which we could hope to lead better lives. And we need to remember that the pandemic isn't entirely new. and it's affecting us in all sorts of ways that go far beyond health and disease. I happen to be a physician. Somebody else might be a public health officer or a biomedical scientist working at the laboratory bench. Each of us has contributions to make in our own particular profession, but we also have at least potential contributions to make, again, simply as family members, friends, neighbors, fellow citizens, and so forth. And I think perhaps the most important response we can make is what I'll call for the moment the human response. That is being sensitive to one another, curious about one another, connected with each other, and hopefully reaching out with a sense of compassion to try to help people who are in a difficult situation. So some of you may recognize this painting by Vincent van Gogh. It's Van Gogh's The Good Samaritan. The idea is that we can come across people in need. We could just cross over to the other side of the street and continue along our merry way, but we could also recognize that we've come upon somebody in need and reach out to them and try to render aid. And I think to do that, we need to see each other not just as potential culture media for a respiratory virus, but we need to see each other as fellow citizens and neighbors and friends. And that's the spirit in which I'd like to launch into, let's say, the second half or second 2/3 of this presentation, which is to think about the truth of pandemics. There's several long passages in the slides to come, and I'll apologize in advance, but I think these are some of the most illuminating words I've come across when it comes to thinking about a pandemic. And this, of course, is one of the great novelists of the last few centuries, Leo Tolstoy, who reminds us that truth is obtained like gold, not by letting it grow bigger, but by washing off from it everything that isn't gold. That's an odd thing to say, but I think what Tolstoy means and what we need to remember as we think about our current pandemic is that the pandemic can strip some things away, things we're sorry to let go of, but it can strip some things away from us and land us in an unfamiliar situation such that we can see with fresh eyes what's really most important to us in life. That sounds kind of presumptuous, but I think it's possible. The pandemic might be regarded as a kind of fire through which we're passing, and when we emerge on the other side through that fire, perhaps we've been purified in a sense. Perhaps we can recognize that some of the things we formerly cared about a great deal turn out not to be so important. And perhaps there are some things we were neglecting before the pandemic that we can now see more clearly and focus more intently on. So with this remark by Tolstoy as prologue, I'd like to think about a text that I hope we're all familiar with, namely Albert Camus' The Plague. Hopefully each of us has had a chance to revisit The Plague sometime in the year 2020. I think it's a really eye-opening and thought-provoking text for thinking about COVID-19. And just to remind you a little bit about Camus, he was born in 1913, died in 1960, actually in an automobile crash in a car driven by his publisher. He was born in French Algeria, quite poor. He overcame a number of obstacles and eventually managed to write a university thesis on Augustine of Hippo. Some of us might say Saint Augustine. He joined the French resistance in World War II, and then in 1942 he published his first well-known novel, The Stranger. And then in 1947, in the midst of a lingering catastrophe, he publishes The Plague. And then in 1957, he receives the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Plague can be a somewhat enigmatic work that doesn't seem to reward our effort to read it. But I think if we read it from the appropriate perspective, particularly in the midst of our own pandemic, we may be able to see some insights there that would otherwise escape us. And I also want to make the point, during my own medical and biological education, I was fortunate to read some good books that were entirely outside the fields of biomedical science and clinical medicine, but I think have enriched my work as a physician and also made a difference in my life. And I hope the same's true for you. To become a great biologist, it's not enough to study and practice biology. We need to look outside the confines of our discipline. And I think 2020 is an especially good year to look to Albert Camus' The Plague. So you may recall, really the rest of what I'm going to say draws on The Plague, and I hope it's a text that you're glad to have a chance to revisit for the next 15 minutes or so. But I remind you that The Plague is set in the Algerian town of Oran, and it opens with a description of the people of Oran that might in some respects apply to us, or at least to people, to communities, to societies we know. And Camus says the people of Oran are unable to love. Why? In part because their gaze is fixed on the ground at their feet. I start out every day with a to-do list, and I start ticking off boxes, and some boxes go away, but new items are added, and I paddle water throughout most of the day, getting things done, but having new things added, and maybe love doesn't enter my consciousness, at least not as often as it should. And I think Camus thinks that not only the people of Oran, but many of us, people earning master's degrees and doctorates and doing postdocs and doing important work as faculty scientists, that we may in fact sometimes find ourselves wandering shadows that can find substance only by rooting ourselves in the solid earth of our distress. In other words, a disaster, a catastrophe, a pandemic is a chance to become more firmly rooted. It's showing us some things that might otherwise escape our notice, and our mission is not to flee from them, but rather to reside with them and in them for a time so they can fully penetrate our heads and our hearts. So those of you who've read The Plague, and I hope everyone will if you haven't already, and I'd especially say the people in for the biggest treat are those who've already read The Plague but return to it, because very often it's in renewing our acquaintance with a great book that I think the most insights tend to arise. I'll just talk briefly about three characters. One is Dr. Bernard Rieu, who identifies himself as an atheist, basically somebody who finds it difficult to believe that there could be a God in the midst of all the suffering. Why would a benevolent, all-powerful, comprehensible, that is comprehensible by us, why would such a God permit such widespread suffering as we associate with COVID-19? So Dr. Rieu doubts that any divine agent is in charge of things, but he's also very dedicated to the relief of suffering. He often wonders whether what he's doing is making any difference, but he doesn't let his determination to do what he can waver. The second character I'll mention briefly is Othon, who's a magistrate, I guess lower level judge, who finds himself in the position of judging the people of Oran. And he's he seems pretty distant, pretty calculating, perhaps even pretty cold, but he's going to undergo a bit of a change over the course of the novel. And then the final person I want to mention is Father Panalus, a man of the cloth, a priest who initially is inclined to regard the plague, the pandemic, as a punishment, that the people of Iran are being punished for the lives they've led, but later perhaps comes to think of the plague as something more like a test of faith. So that's by no means a sufficient introduction or background to the text, but even if that was unfamiliar and didn't quite land effectively, we can go on to talk about a couple of scenes in the book. And here's early on in the plague. Everybody knows that pestilences, the influenza pandemic of 1918, HIV/AIDS, COVID-19, pestilences have a way of recurring in the world. Yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. I think the suggestion is we need to know history so we can recognize when history is unfolding around us, when we're in fact being swept up in history, because if we recognize it sooner, we may be able to respond to it better. And by the way, those of you interested in the connection between plagues and wars as causes of human misery, I would commend to your attention a book by a teacher at my alma mater, the University of Chicago. His name was William H. McNeill, and the name of his book is Plagues and Peoples. And McNeill basically makes the case that infectious disease has exerted a far greater effect on human history than military campaigns or military technology or battle strategy. In other words, the big actor in human life is plagues. Wars, by comparison, have played a smaller role. So just to emphasize that while the plague is a work of fiction, it's talking about something real. This is a site being excavated in the French city of Marseille. And, these are human beings who lost their lives in a plague. We have, as I say, ample evidence of prehistoric, ancient, medieval, modern plagues taking a great toll on human communities, and here's the tangible physical evidence of such a toll. So I want to read brief excerpts from a couple of the sermons delivered by Father Panalus. This is actually a painting of an important American theologian and philosopher, Jonathan Edwards, but we can imagine Father Panalus preaching to the distressed people of Iran in the midst of a plague. What would you say to people if you could speak to dozens or hundreds or maybe even thousands of people besieged by plague? Well, Father Panalus' first sermon goes like this: "Calamity has come upon you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserved it." Basically, he's telling the people of Iran that they have not lived as they ought to have done, and some kind of divine judgment has now descended upon them. I think, from the standpoint of the biological sciences, contemporary medicine, and public health, we might regard a suggestion like this as ridiculous, a relic of some long past way of understanding human suffering. But Father Panalus delivers this sermon, and he says, this terrible plague gives us a glimpse of that radiant eternal light which glows, a small still flame in the dark core of human suffering. And this light too illuminates the shadowed paths that lead toward deliverance. It reveals the will of God in action, unfailingly transforming evil into good. Well, I'm not here to endorse Father Panalus' perspective, but I just want to remind us that human beings often deal with mass catastrophe, including pandemics, from a kind of cosmic perspective. We try to understand not just what microbe is responsible. Is this secondary to miasma, how people used to understand pestilences, foul-smelling air, I guess, but is this in fact the product of an intelligence, or at least forces at work in nature that are somehow responding to what we've done and who we've been? You know, global warming or climate change, is that somehow a judgment, or at least payment of just deserts for the kind of decisions we human beings have been making? Many people in our midst wonder about crises like this from that kind of perspective. Maybe this is more than just a virus, more than just a communicable disease. Well, now I want to turn to a scene in the plague, certainly the most horrible, difficult to endure scenes in the text, which has a profound effect on Father Panalus. And that is the scene of Othon's son's death. The magistrate's son contracts plague, and many of the main characters in the book go to visit him there. People who've bound together to try to fight the plague, they convene in the room where the magistrate's son is dying. And I'll just remind you that that scene is set in a former classroom. We spend a lot of our time in classrooms. Interestingly, it's dimly lit. We like to think that, you know, our PowerPoint presentations transmit a lot of light, but it's possible that in some respects, even the houses of learning, colleges and universities, can be dimly lit. In fact, Camus says there's just enough light in the room to make out a half obliterated equation on the blackboard. You know, I think the clear suggestion is, of what use are our equations, our charts and our graphs in the face of this unfortunate child? You know, how do our equations help us in this case? And the scene, the child's posture is described as a grotesque parody of the crucifixion. His arms are thrown out to the sides. He himself assumes a cross-like posture. Some of you may recognize this painting. It's by Sir Luke Fildes. It's called The Doctor, painted, I think, around 1890. And, you know, it's become one of the emblems of the profession of medicine. Here, the physician is attending a little girl dying of diphtheria. And even though in 1890 he's powerless to stop the disease, he remains by his patient's side. And that's what's happening in Camus' The Plague. The men who've converged on the magistrate's son's sickbed, they can't stop the plague, but they're there as witnesses. And I want to suggest, I think one of our most important roles in the COVID-19 pandemic may be to witness it, to actually see what's happening and share what we see with other people. So this is pretty gruesome, and I apologize for that, but I want to read a few paragraphs from the text because I think they're very illuminating when we think about our own pandemic. So the characters had already seen children die. For many months now, death had shown no favoritism, but they had never yet watched a child's agony minute by minute, as they had now been doing since daybreak. I don't know if you've ever been with a child who's dying. You know, I'm a pediatrician, a children's doctor, and I have. Needless to say, the pain inflicted on these innocent victims had always seemed to them what in fact it was, an abominable thing. But hitherto they had felt its abomination in, so to speak, an abstract way. They had never had to witness over so long a period the death throes of an innocent child. Okay, suppose we did somehow bring it on ourselves by bad choices we've made in the past. But why would an innocent child need to suffer so horribly and die? Only the child went on fighting with all his little might. These men are gathered around the bed. Now and then Ria, the doctor, took his pulse, less because this served any purpose than as an escape from his utter helplessness. And when he closed his eyes, he seemed to feel its tumult mingling with the fever of his own blood. You know, child's dying from the plague. The doctor can't think of anything to do except take his patient's pulse. And then, at one with the tortured child, he struggled to sustain him with all the remaining strength of his own body. Can we link our lives with the lives of another person? Linked for a few moments, the rhythms of their heartbeats soon fell apart. The child escaped him, and again he knew his impotence. Then he released the small, thin wrist and moved back to his place. This is an experience you have certainly in the practice of medicine and probably most of the health professions. Some patients we can cure. Other patients we can palliate their suffering and extend their lives. But, the human mortality rate remains fixed at 100.0%. I mean, death awaits us all. And to some degree, being a good doctor, a good nurse, and a good person may mean not working resolutely against death to the last possible moment, but actually, in some ways, accepting death and trying to help people die well, because rather than poorly. To some, that may seem an odd notion, but could it be that there are good deaths and bad deaths, or at least better deaths and worse deaths? And to what degree are we working to try to help those who are very sick and suffering die well? Well, this is difficult, but I'm going to read it. In the small face, rigid as a mask of grayish clay, slowly the lips parted, and from them rose a long, incessant scream, hardly varying with his respiration, and filling the ward with a fierce, indignant protest, so little childish that it seemed like a collective voice issuing from all the sufferers there. Ria clenched his jaws. Theroux looked away. Rambert went and stood beside Castel, who closed the book lying on his knees. Panalus, the priest, gazed down at the small mouth, fouled with the sores of the plague, and pouring out the angry death cry that has sounded through the ages of mankind. He sank on his knees, and all present found it natural to hear him say, in a voice hoarse but clearly audible across that nameless, never-ending wail, "My God, spare this child." So, as I say, a difficult scene to read about, to imagine, but ultimately we're presented with something that we can't fix. Now, of course, we have masks and social distancing. We have antiviral drugs. We may soon have effective vaccines. I'm not suggesting we bow our heads in resignation. The important work you and your colleagues are doing will, I think, alleviate a lot of suffering and more important, prevent a great deal of suffering more. But nonetheless, there are people dying today of COVID-19. And we need to be careful not to displace our awareness so much into the future. Our expectations for effective treatment, a cure, a vaccine to prevent the infection. We don't want to displace our consciousness so much into the future that we fail to attend to what's happening around us, and in particular, the loss of life that's going on today. So Father Panalus, remember, he's the one at the foot of the bed who says, "My God, spare this child." Father Panalus delivers a second sermon in Camus' The Plague. And here is part of what he says. "My brothers, the love of God is a hard love. It demands total self-surrender, disdain of our human personality, and yet it alone can reconcile us to suffering and the deaths of children. It alone can justify them, since we cannot understand them, and we can only make God's will ours." That is the hard lesson I would share with you today. That is the faith, cruel in men's eyes and crucial in God's, which we must ever strive to compass. We must aspire beyond ourselves toward that high and fearful vision. And on that lofty plane, all will fall into place, all discords be resolved, and truth flash forth from the dark cloud of seeming injustice. So I'm not trying to argue for a theological perspective on the pandemic or plagues in general, but you can see a transition here in how Father Panalus feels, how he thinks about the plague, which is that some things in the world may be incomprehensible to us. Some of them may become comprehensible because of the forward march of science. So for a long time, nobody knew that microscopic organisms could cause disease. And even more recently, nobody knew that there were microbes called viruses. But, with the onward march of science fueled by technologies like microscopy, we now know that there are these microscopic agents of disease. But, that answers some kinds of questions and opens our eyes to some kinds of responses, like better antiviral drugs and, producing effective vaccines. But a human problem remains. The dying child has a parent, and perhaps grandparents, and aunts and uncles, and cousins, and neighbors, and so forth. And we need to be alert to that dimension of human suffering. And I think Father Panalus cautions us against adopting easy explanations, that there are existential questions, for some cosmic questions, for some, let's say, theological or religious questions about pandemics that science, the science of biology can't answer. Now, maybe that means those questions are nonsense. You see that turn in some 20th century philosophy, analytic philosophy, for example. It's just a nonsense question. But I think we human beings find ourselves asking why. And I think Father Panalus is counseling us that we may not always know why. That is, our power to perceive, to understand, to predict, to control is much smaller than the forces at work out there in the world, and is likely to remain so, perhaps forever. Things will be happening that we don't understand, and until we admit to ourselves in some way that we don't fully understand, we may cut ourselves off from the possibility of ministering effectively, that is, caring effectively, responding with genuine compassion to the suffering of those around us, those dear to us, perhaps even to our own suffering. And maybe the most important transformation in the plague isn't Father Panalus, but the magistrate whose son has died. By the way, they don't tell the magistrate how horribly his son died. But the magistrate soon shows up, and he asks to help with the plague. And they rebuff him, and he says, "I'm afraid I did not make myself clear. I'm told there are some voluntary workers from government offices in that camp, the camp where they're sequestering the plague victims. To work there would keep me busy, you see. And also, I know it may sound absurd, but I'd feel less separated from my little boy." Rhea, the doctor, stared at him. Could it be that a sudden gentleness showed in those hard, inexpressive eyes? I'm not issuing any grand call here for some transformation of character, but I am wondering whether each of us is capable of a bit more gentleness in what could sometimes be our hard, inexpressive eyes. You know, trying to treat the pandemic as a scientific problem, a technical problem, an economic or a political problem. It's all of those things, but I say again, perhaps it's also a human problem. And perhaps if we can stay with it for a while, face up to it, reside with it and in it, perhaps our eyes can be opened, and opened in a way that gives us the possibility to show a bit more gentleness. So, you think about plagues, it's kind of a terrestrial event. We're a part of a much bigger world, let's say, a much bigger universe. Reality with a capital R, we're only a pretty small corner of it, and that might be the understatement of the ages. I just remind you, for example, this is one kooky statistic, that the sun generates a lot of energy from second to second, and of all the energy it generates, perhaps 1/1,000,000,000 of the energy strikes the planet Earth. There's a whole lot of energy radiating out into space. We survive on 2/1,000,000,000ths of it. In a way, we are a tiny, 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 infinitesimally small part of something infinitely greater, just in terms of space. And if you think about it in terms of time, our lives are less than the blink of an eye in a geologic or certainly cosmic time scale. And I say this not as a counsel to despair, but maybe an indication to look again for where our significance really lies. Organisms have been coming into existence and leaking out of existence. Whole species have been born and died over long periods of time. But we perhaps are especially aware of what's happening around us and within us. And I think in the words of Father Panalus and perhaps even the magistrate Othon, we can find a kind of wisdom. We can open ourselves up and adopt a kind of gentleness, compassion, fellow feeling that gives us a chance to contribute more to the lives of others, to share more with others, and thereby to come more to life ourselves. The pandemic is a disaster. It's a nearly unmitigated disaster, but it is also, I hate to say this, a learning opportunity. And only if we open our heads and our hearts appropriately are those lessons going to be recognized by us, perhaps remain with us, and maybe even change us in subtle ways that make us better scientists, better health professionals, and perhaps even better human beings. This again is Van Gogh's The Good Samaritan. Perhaps the human mission isn't just to make the world a better place, to rid the world of scourges like COVID-19 or HIV/AIDS or the H1N1 influenza virus. Perhaps the human presence is also a matter of discernment. When we come across those, first, do we come across those who are suffering? Well, the answer is yes. And when we do, perhaps we're presented with an opportunity to discern what's most essential in our experience. Maybe in a way, what's most beautiful in our experience. No one would ever wish that someone should be set upon by robbers and beaten to within an inch of his life. But the Good Samaritan comes upon such a person who's lost everything, nearly lost his own life. But his response is not to cross to the other side of the road and carry on, but rather to stop and render aid. And perhaps in that rendering of aid, there's a kind of beauty. We wish that beauty weren't necessary, but when it is revealed to us, let us hope we perceive it, and that it penetrates into our heads and our hearts, because I think if it does, it's connecting us with something quite real, something we can't detect with our MRI scanners or our spectrophotometers, but something that is very, very real and needs to be recognized by us, to the extent possible understood by us, and perhaps even felt by us. And I remind you of those words of Leo Tolstoy. What does pandemic do to us? Well, it may show us the truth more clearly than we've seen it before. And to requote Tolstoy, the truth is obtained like gold, not by letting it grow bigger, but by washing off from it everything that isn't gold. Perhaps we're passing through a kind of furnace, and perhaps that can burn away some impurities and ultimately help us to see more clearly what's most real and what's most true. So to the rhetorical question I posed in the title, can a deadly pandemic teach us how to live? I think the answer is yes. But it's quite possible that those teachings will be lost on us, lost to us. And it's only by keeping our eyes and our ears and our hearts open that we have any chance of learning those lessons and sharing them with others, which I think really could make for a better life. Okay, I'll stop there. I recognize this is kind of a peculiar presentation, but I hope it wasn't entirely off-putting. And, I hope it'll lead to some conversations.
Thank you very much once again, Professor Gunderman, for your very thought-provoking talk, which I think perhaps we could all take some time to process those information. Well, now I'll be moderating a Q&A session. So just as a reminder, if you're on Zoom, you could ask your questions in person, send them to me or post them on the chat. And if you're on YouTube, feel free to post your questions on the live chat. So we have one question from YouTube. It says, thank you ever so much for the insightful talk. What would you say is the most urgent prayer we should pray before we die physically?
What is the most urgent prayer we should pray before we die physically? I'm not sure, but here's one of the top 10 prayers I think we need to pray urgently before we meet our Maker, so to speak. And that would be that by what we've learned and felt, that we might have had a chance to enrich the lives of others. That maybe we help push back the veil of ignorance or push forward the envelope of biomedical knowledge. That's certainly a good thing, but perhaps also that we can maybe care for a human being in need, to recognize that person's need, to feel that person's need somehow inside ourselves, and to reach out to that person in the spirit of compassion. That may be somebody struggling to breathe because they have a severe case of COVID-19. That may be somebody who's simply quite lonely because they're trying to prevent themselves from contracting COVID-19. That may be somebody who works in the lab next to you or sits in the classroom next to you, if people still sit together in classrooms. You know, there's loneliness. There's suffering in our midst. We may need a PhD in biochemistry to combat SARS-CoV-2, but we may need something like an advanced degree in humanity if we're going to recognize and respond to the suffering of those in whose midst we work and dwell. And I just have a deep sense that while we're doing our important work in biology, we should make some time to read some good books that aren't strictly speaking biological. And, you know, I would suggest that Albert Camus' The Plague is one such book. You know, if you could read 10 pages or a page a day of that over the course of the next few months, I just wonder if it might make a difference in your life and act as a kind of catalyst to help you make a bigger and better difference in the lives of others. I mean, I think that is an aspiration lofty enough to warrant praying for. That, you know, we could ease the suffering of others and let them know they're not alone, that we are somehow here for them. That would be an essential part of a life well lived, I think.
Thank you. There's one question from Zoom, so from Jennifer. A very moving and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you. How can career and egotistical politicians controlling our response be persuaded to respond as you suggest? Well,
that's a great question. And, you know, if there were a simple answer to that, it would have been implemented some time ago. I think, you know, politics may be a calling in life that fosters the habit of expressing concern for others while often devoting most of one's time and energy to protecting and advancing oneself. I don't mean to say that the political sphere is entirely populated by egoists or hypocrites, because I don't believe that. But you know, the habits that are inculcated in us over years and decades profoundly shape us. And if your top priority is getting elected, getting yourself elected, if that's mission number one, it fosters a tendency to think about oneself. So, you know, I guess one answer might be to try to get saintly figures to go into politics, but I'm not sure that's a very tenable prescription. I think maybe a better approach, you know, is to simply be, this is going to be unsatisfying, but here it is, to be as caring and compassionate a citizen and neighbor and friend as you can be. You know, Mohandas Gandhi never said it in these words, but you see it all the time. Be the change you want to see in the world. I mean, before we set about procuring for ourselves the politicians we think we so richly deserve, perhaps we should look inward and try to make sure we're doing the best we can ourselves. That in small ways, with respect to people in chronic care facilities or hospitals or clinics, you know, people who may be living near us but be unknown to us, make sure we're doing right by them. And you know, once we've satisfied ourselves that we've we've acquitted ourselves well in that mission, then maybe we can turn more of our attention to our political leaders. That's potentially inflammatory and at best unsatisfying, but when I begin to hate the haters, those who hate, when I begin to indulge my passion for hating them, on rare occasions I come to my senses and realize that by hating the haters, I've joined the haters. And I think each of us has so many opportunities in our own lives to attend to these matters, to learn from them and put what we learn into action, and then learn from acting, learn from caring, that's probably at least a good starting aspiration for many of us, and in some cases may turn out to be a kind of lifelong calling in itself. I'm sorry that was so obtuse, but it's what I think.
Thank you. We have one question from Zoom. As a clinician, how do you think the current situation will affect the organizational structure of healthcare? Will we see more care conducted at home?
That's a great question. All of these are great questions. I think the answer is yes. I think we are awakening to the realization that health is not as individual a property as we've taken it to be. I mean, I was trained as a medical school, postgraduate training here in the United States, residency and fellowship, years of practice. I was trained to think of health and disease as the properties of individual organisms. I focus on my patient's blood glucose, or my patient's waistline, or my patient's BMI or blood pressure, and I focus on getting them to lead a healthier life and take certain medications. And when their blood pressure goes down or their blood glucose levels go down, I pat myself on the back. I'm a good doctor. I've enhanced my patient's health. But I think in many cases, the roots of these problems lie in, this is not by any means a novel observation. The roots of these problems lie in families and communities and neighborhoods, in towns and cities. And I think we really do need to think more about enhancing the health of those levels of human organization. Let's say healthy neighborhoods. If we could do something to improve the vitality and resilience of neighborhoods, many of the problems I think we associate with health might be indirectly reduced. And so I do believe that the pandemic is awakening us to the fact that much care to be delivered well needs to be delivered in the context of the home. That doesn't always mean making house calls, although it often may. But if we don't see our patients and their families and their neighbors in context, if we only see them in the intensive care unit when they're hooked up to a ventilator, or as they appear when they show up in the emergency department of a hospital, we're not really seeing them. We don't have a sufficiently comprehensive vision of what they are and who they are, and that's going to hamper and maybe even corrupt our efforts to tend to their health. So yes, I think we need to see human beings more in context, and that very often means seeing us at home or at work, where we spend most of our waking hours. And I hope we can introduce more of that perspective in the education of health professionals in the future.
Thank you. So maybe I should conclude the Q&A session with a comment from YouTube, from Craig. Thank you very much for approaching the bridge between the function and meaning of life Professor Gunderman, for encouraging us to ask those questions with a calling to care for others. So if there are no more questions, I shall wrap up the talk. So thank you once again, Professor Gunderman, for firstly taking us through a brief history of infectious diseases, describing and discussing the impacts of the pandemic on multiple aspects of our life.
It's my pleasure. And let me just say, I've really enjoyed being with you today, and I hope some of you will regard the past, what's it been, 75 minutes or so, not as the end of a lecture, but as the opening of a conversation. And if any of you are interested in pursuing these matters further, by telephone, video conference, email, whatever works best for you, I'd love to carry on the conversation. And I really mean that. So my gratitude is to you for the opportunity to spend this time with you today. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yes, like Professor Gunderman mentioned, so as always, if you have any questions, whether you are watching this live or after the talk, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to comment under the YouTube video or send BioSoc an email. We can always convey, we can always pass on the messages to Professor Gunderman. And yeah, my personal takeaway from this talk, well, it's already very well concluded, but I think we could all learn many lessons from this pandemic. We are all differentially affected by the pandemic, but I think one thing in common is that we could, when we are able to do something that could improve the lives of others and ourselves, even when the situation seems to be difficult. And also thank you for introducing that wonderful book. I think I'll definitely give it a read. Yeah, there's actually a lot of things to take in. So yeah, feel free to send us an email or post comments on our social media. And we will pass on the messages to Professor Gunderman. So thank you once again. And
bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us. Bye.